So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our second last set of regulations that we will be reviewing this afternoon. This is the draft civil aviation units of measurements to be used in air and ground operations regulations. The presentation will be done by Ms. Caroline Mbiti, who is our Senior Aeronautical Information Officer. Before we start, I'd like to remind all of us that in case you intend to make any verbal presentation, kindly do so by indicating under the Ask a Questions tab, and you will be given an opportunity to make your presentation. Also, we are requesting for feedback under the polls tab. Kindly let us have your feedback on this forum that we have been holding, being the Public Participation Forum on the Draft Civil Aviation Regulations 2021. We'll appreciate your feedback during the. We will appreciate your feedback that will enable us better prepare next time, and also know the areas of improvement and what we need to do in future public participation forums. So the draft civil aviation units of measurements to be used in air and ground operations regulations is domestication of Annex 5 to the Chicago Convention. Will be taken through by Ms. Caroline Mbiti. We are also think that we will also be having the next presentation being the draft civil aviation construction of visual and instrument flight procedures regulations being undertaken back to back by our Mr. David Ondieki, the manager aerodromes, air navigation services, and meteorological regulations. Thereafter, we will have an opportunity to make any comments or request for the floor for purposes of making any verbal presentation. So after this presentation, we will have the next set of regulations being presented, the draft civil aviation, construction of visual and instrument flight procedures. Thereafter, we'll go through some of the comments that we have received so far before giving you the opportunity to take the floor and give any verbal presentations on the regulations that have been presented to this afternoon. So please also remember that you can give your written submissions. Kindly email the same to kcas2021@kcaa.or.ke. So Ms. Caroline Beatty, kindly take the floor and take us through the civil aviation units of measurement to be used in air and ground operations regulations 2021. Ms. Beatty.
My name is Caroline Beatty. I'll be taking you through units of measurement regulations that is in reference to Okay, for Annex 5, we don't have an amendment to this annex that might have necessitated us to have a review of these regulations. But what we did, we were reviewing to align the regulations to the document, to the annex as it is, because there are some mistakes we had made in the initial edition of our regulations from Annex 5. So these regulations are based on Annex 5, the 5th edition of 2010. So under citation, we're going to change the regulations to read civil aviation units of measurement to be used in air and ground operations regulations 2021. Then we have a new part introduced. This is just basically to align the regulations to the contents of Annex 5. So, and the new part introduced is Part 2, which deals with applicability. In the initial regulations, that is Regulations 2018, application was under Part 1. So this time around, we are having it under part 2. The same content, everything. This regulation shall apply to all aspects of civil aviation, air and ground operations. That is with reference to Annex 5, Part 2.1. Then Part 2 of the regulations was renumbered to read Part 3. The title is the same, Standard Application of Units of Measurement. Regulation number 4, it was on international systems of units. We are changing the reference of the regulations. Initially, we were talking of the international systems of units international systems of units developed and maintained by the General Conference of Weights and Measures shall subject to regulations 5 and 6. Now we will be referring to subject to regulations 5 and 7. The rest remains the same. Now to regulation number 5, non-SI units. This part had been omitted in our previous regulations, so this time we're introducing it, and it shall read like the NSI unit listed in Table 2 in the first schedule shall be used either in lieu of or in addition to SI units as primary units of measurement, but only as specified in Table 4 of the first schedule of these regulations. That is reference to 321 of Annex 5. Regulation number 6, it was renumbered to, from regulation number 5, we have renumbered it to regulation number 6. And then there's another change. If you see in the 2018 edition, the SI unit listed in this first schedule shall be permitted for temporary use as alternative measurement, but only for those specific quantities listed in Table 4. Now, in the new regulation, we are going ahead and talking of Table 4 of the first schedule of these regulations. Then we introduced Part 4 of the regulations, which will be termination of use of non-SI alternative units. Initially, regulation number 9 was under Part 3. So now it will be falling under Part 4. This requirement was moved to Part 4 for consistency with the annex, but there is no change in content. And then we introduced Part 5, which covers offenses and penalties. Regulation number 10, we didn't have offenses, which reads, any violation to this regulation shall be subject to the penalty provisions as provided in the Civil Aviation Act. And then a new part, Part 6. Some corrections under the new content text, we are having Part 4, Part 5. It should read Part 6, which deals with repeal, savings, and transitional provisions. Then regulation number 11, it's on a revocation. The civil aviation units of measurement to be used for air and ground operations, regulations 2018 are hereby revoked. This is for purpose of providing cancellation for the existing regulations. And then the last one we have the shared use. In the former regulations 2018, we have taken snapshots for the tables from Annex 5. Now we worked on the tables, we developed the tables and keyed in all the correct data and removed the images for purposes of clarity. So this is a very short set of regulations, and that's all what we did. Back to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Carol, for taking us through the presentation. Indeed, it is quite a short one. For 4 slides. This is a draft civil aviation units of measurements to be used in air and ground operations. As had been indicated at the beginning of this session, we will be going to the next presentation that will be done by our manager, aerodromes, air navigation services, and meteorological regulations. The presentation will be on the draft civil aviation, construction of visual and instrument flight procedures regulations. Please feel free to indicate in case you wish to make any verbal presentations under the questions tab. Kindly just indicate that you wish to be given the stage, and an opportunity will be accorded for you to address the forum. Similarly, please also let us have your feedback under the polls tab for purposes of ensuring that future stakeholder engagements and use of such platforms as we are using right now is improved, as well as we ensure that we receive all your comments accordingly. Now, I will be requesting my colleague, that's Mr. David Ondieki, to come on the stage and take us through the draft civil aviation construction of visual and instrument flight procedures regulations 2021. Bwana Ondieki.
Thank you so much, Dennis, for the opportunity to make this particular presentation, and also thank the participants who have been so patient and kind to be with us since we started in the morning. And now that this is the last presentation of the day, I believe it's not the least, but also it's just on the out of schedule. I will be quite brief. We have a matrix that is around 19 pages, but this one will be covered in a shorter period of time. And we will also provide feedback on a communication that is already received from the industry in terms of areas of improvement of the provisions. Just as a brief indication, these provisions are basically anchored on document 8168 that relates to the development of instrument and visual and instrument flight procedures. And also this particular requirement is also contained in the annex as an obligation to the state that requires, for example, the need to regulate the development of these particular procedures, which are key tools that facilitate aircraft operations to and out of our airports, and ensure approval of the same provisions once they are developed and they are done by persons who are competent. So if I can go directly to the matrix with that brief introduction, we have the interpretation part of it. We have a new provision, especially defining the certificated flight procedure design. But remember, I mentioned this in the morning, it's basically a certified somebody who is authorized to provide this particular service, meaning a service provider authorized through the issuance of a certificate to design, document, validate, maintain, and periodically review flight procedures necessary for the safety, regularity, and efficiency of air navigation. So it's a new interpretation that you have added. As we were saying since yesterday and this morning, the next interpretation on the integrated aeronautical information product is basically a consequence of the changes in Annex 15. Since this particular provision was updated, it cuts across all documents. Remember that the end product of this particular process that we are talking about, that's the construction of visual and instrument flight procedures, ends up in the aeronautical information publication that is also guided by the provisions or the standards and recommended practice contained in Annex 15, and hence the consequential effect to the civil aviation aeronautical information services regulations as indicated. So basically, as a result of that improvement, we did an update and did the necessary changes to reflect the content of Annex 15. Another new interpretation on the same is basically the designer. The term designer is an inclusion, especially from the provision of document 9906. Designer means a person adequately trained who performs the design of an instrument flight procedure which is basically an inclusion so that we can be able to have the same explained as we come through the regulation so that the regulation can be much clearer. Flight, the term flight is also been clarified, and which means the flight procedure designer um, means the complete package. Flight procedure design means the complete package that includes all the consideration that went into the development of the instrument flight procedure, such that this particular element is required, especially when submitting for approval by the regulator. And this is the package that is able to be supported, and is a provision that is contained document 9906 volume 1 under the quality assurance program of flight procedure design elements. In terms of the next interpretation is the flight procedure designer. This is the personnel who is assigned, which means a person responsible for flight procedure design who meets the competency requirement as laid down by the state. And in this case, for this particular one, will be requiring as reflected by the provisions of the authority. I think that element of the state would be amended to read the state as laid down by the state, the authority. We also introduced an interpretation flight procedure. Process means the overarching process from data origination to the publication of an instrument of a flight procedure design. Sorry for that. The overarching process from data origination to the publication of an instrument flight procedure. And basically that is the change to incorporate the exclusion that was there that was not provided before. The next term that was introduced was flight procedure design. Remember that there was the provision of having an inclusion to both visual and instrument flight procedures. However, under this provision, we have an indication whereby we want to have the term flight procedure design depict both the inclusion of visual and instrument flight procedures, such that the person who is designated for provision or certificated for provision of this service means that he's able to provide for both, and hence that's why you could see the amendment whereby the reference to the term flight procedure design is not normally or not necessarily anchored on the visual or instrument. In this case, the definition then will read flight procedure design service means a service established for the design, documentation, validation, maintenance, and the periodic review of flight procedures necessary for the safety, regularity, and efficiency of air navigation. So the term prescribed has also been changed to specified as indicated previously. Another term is a definition or a clarification of the visual flight procedures, means a description of a series of predetermined maneuvers by reference to visual aids, markers published by electronic or printed means, which means that is a provision that is taken on board of both the visual and instrument flight procedures as required in this regulation. So with that first part of taking care of the interpretation, and more specifically the incorporations of key definitions that are necessary for the interpretation and understanding of these provisions, I can go to the first amendment of the regulation that is on sub-regulation number 4 that talks of the requirements for the provision of flight procedure design. And then the first amendment that is done for clarity is that a person shall not provide a flight procedure design service within Kenya unless the issue here is there are conditions that are provided under that particular regulation. Then this was basically an amendment so that we could be able to cater for the flight procedure design function that is both inclusive of the visual and instrument designs. Regulation 4B subsection 1 Roman 1 says it's basically a deletion of the word prescribed, and it's under the requirements for the provision of flight procedure design service, and hence the amendment results with this proposed input that says the service providers shall be in accordance with the requirements in these regulations or in other publications issued by the authority. Sub-regulation Regulation number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 19. The specific reference to the term instrument has been removed such that we are able to make reference directly to a flight procedure design so that it can be able to cater for both visual and instrument flight procedures as depicted in document 8168 volume 2, so that we can be able to be in tandem to that particular requirement. Regulation 5, subregulation 2A, that is the designation of flight procedure design service provider. It should be able the new content that has been provided specifically to remove the word instrument for a flight procedure design process that encompasses acquisition of data, design, and promulgation of procedures. Subregulation number 8, in terms of employment of personnel, it is basically an amendment for clarity, and in this case, we are making reference to flight procedure design personnel. This is a title. This is just an amendment on the subtitle of the regulation. Regulation number 8A and B, in terms of employment of personnel, it is a review for clarity where we deleted the term employ or contract, employ, contract, or engage, but now the subsection reads as follows: the certificated flight procedure design, and as amended early in the morning, is the certified flight procedure design organization shall engage sufficient personnel to plan, verify, and maintain the flight procedures, and B, develop job description for its flight procedure design technical staff. So which means basically a clarification is an addition of the word flight and also the deletion of employee contract, but then we preferred the use of the term engage in depending on the terms of the specific terms that will be able to be provided. Regulation number 9.2 was an editorial omission, but is basically borrowed from document 9906 part 1 or section 1 on the quality assurance in terms of the personnel who ought to be engaged by the service provider or the provider or the certified provider of this particular function, and the competencies could be either from air traffic control, engineering, aeronautical technicians, pilot, just to name a few within the aviation provision. And I think it's important so that during review of the competencies of persons who are working under this, they ought to be in tandem with the provision of the International Civil Aviation Organization. Regulation number 9, subregulation 4A, flight procedure design, training, experience, and approval. Talks of knowledge of information contained in the documents and manuals pertaining the design of flight procedures as prescribed by the authority. And I think it's a more clarification, and especially this will now be contained in the various aspects or elements that are normally provided in various specifications that the authority is able to provide in terms of various like the advisory circular, so that it can be able to make some specific provisions clear. I remember under this particular subsection, you have promulgated an advisory circular that is key and specific in terms of the training of personnel and ensuring that these particular elements are able to be addressed as applicable and as required by the authority. Regulation number 7, regulation number 9, subregulation 7A, under the flight procedure designer training experience and approval. The old content has been amended, and now the new content under item A is reading: provide proof of successful completion of the training of the International Civil Aviation Organization for air navigation services, aircraft operation. Basically, this is the basic training that is required for purposes of undertaking the key acquisition of knowledge that will enable one for purposes of provision of a service as a flight procedure designer. So there was an acronym or an abbreviation that was used here before, but the same has been provided in detail. In terms of regulation number 11 of quality assurance, the same has been amended as to read: the service provider shall establish and implement a quality assurance process for all the flight procedure design functions and processes. And if you remember, within document 9906, these provisions start, there are in 16 number that touch from the initiation process right to the maintenance of this particular element. So in every phase, within the phase of the lifespan of our flight procedure, we should be able to have this adequately documented and the records stored so that they can be able to be verified as required within the provisions of these regulations. Regulation number 13 talks of the control of documents and records. The new provision that is updating that particular regulation is talking about establish and put into effect a system for controlling documents and records relating the flight procedure on which the designer carries on design work, including the policies and procedure for making, amending, preserving, and disposing of those documents. So which means as a change is being done, it is specifically documented as necessary. And as a review is taking place, they say the previous record that has been reviewed is able to be retained and maintained as required. Regulation number 14, that's the flight procedure design, is a new provision to introduce a requirement so that it will be in line with the Annex 6. The design of flight procedure takes into consideration of noise abatement procedures for specific aerodromes is a requirement in Annex 6 that ought to be brought on board so that we can have that aspect included during the design of flight procedures. Regulation number 16 on approval of instrument flight procedures. As you may know, ICAO is very particular that each design that is made ought to be approved by the state, and this has been amended specifically on this regulation to provide for the approval of flight procedures. And it's an introduction of new text, and subregulation 4 is amended to read: the flight procedure designer service provider shall demonstrate that all the appropriate steps within the flight procedure design process have been completed, documented, and signed off by competent personnel. Regulation subregulation 5, flight procedure design submitted for evaluation and approval by the authority are to be accompanied by, and then we have a list of items that are required: a complete record of the design process, a record of quality assurance, a narrative by which describes the procedure, a graphical presentation that reflects the content of the narrative provided, relevant signed validation reports, including meetings, discussions, and sketches made. Considerations, explanations are supposed to be contained. A comprehensive design rationale in text format, including references to the design criteria, applicable computation and national policy, where the deviation from the standard has been a deviation from the standard criteria or policy has been done. And remember, there are a number of documents that have provided for this. If there is a deviation, then this has to be documented. The flight procedure publication, sorry. The flight procedure should be accompanied by a narrative which describes the procedure in contextual format and in compliance with the aeronautical cartographic requirement prescribed by the authority. There's a new provision that has been added. And then number 18, use of automation in procedure design. The provision that we have here is that it's a new one. The flight procedure design service provider shall ensure that the tool or the application used for the design process is regularly updated. There are situations where the service provider is able to acquire the flight procedure design, or the certified flight procedure design provider acquires electronic tools for purposes of management of this function. And in the long run, they do not have a subscription that updates any changes to that, or when there's a revision of the ICAO criteria, these changes are not brought on board, and hence you have a possibility of utilizing a tool that is not current and update. And as a result of that, they need to have specific regulations and provisions that need to ensure that the service provider is using the right tool, the tool is being updated as required, and hence that is the basis of this particular provision. Regulation number 20 talks of the aerodrome operating minima. The source of this, I think, is we also have a review by the International Civil Aviation Organization on the need of publishing the aerodrome operating minima, and hence the requirements for the aerodrome operating minima shall be specified shall be as specified, and this is basically a requirement that has been extracted from Annex 6 for compliance and consistency to ensure that the certified flight procedure designer is able to have specific provisions that are able to address this particular requirement and the promulgation of this, in as much as it could be a responsibility that is transferred to the operator. Then these provisions are contained in the specific regulations that are part of the Kenya Civil Aviation Regulation. So it was important to cross-reference to these regulations. So the use of this particular regulation is able to make an indication that they are able to understand those provisions and they are able to be applied as applicable. The procedures for the establishment of the aerodrome operating minima shall be as prescribed by the authority. I think we have an advisory circular that is specific to this, and we are basically enhancing this particular provision to ensure compliance to these particular provisions. Last but not least, we have a requirement that has been introduced that the certificated flight procedure design service provider shall ensure that an obstacle clearance altitude and height is published, and lastly, they establish and publish the operating minimum edge visibility, minimum descent altitude, height, decision altitude, height for instrument approaches at aerodrome. So those are the changes that have been proposed for this particular section, and it's important that we are able to appreciate this particular provision as required. I want to take this opportunity and be able to share with you comments that have been received from the industry, a memoranda that the authority received, and I wish to make some few remarks on the same. It's with thanks and appreciation we have received this from Susan Munene and Lois Matthew of Gerivia Advocates, that is Jennings Consulting, in terms of comments in respect to the draft civil aviation construction of visual and instrument flight procedures regulations 2020. Their area of concern and the issues that they have specifically raised, I'll quickly go through, and while making reference to the regulations, that is section 2 in terms of the interpretation or the abbreviations, which means that in areas where abbreviations are used, we should be able to have the same in full, and I think this is a valid comment. We will definitely be able to take it on board. Under section 2 also, the definition of the not confirmation circular, there's a typo there whereby we have 3 dots that will be updated. We sincerely appreciate this comment. We will take it on board. In section 2 under air navigation services, what I will say, the definition of air navigation service is consistent with the Civil Aviation Act, and any amendment that can be able to be made only ought to be consistent. There's no way the regulations can contradict the provision of the Civil Aviation Act, and hence any change would be considered. However, with thanks, I appreciate your indication of this particular anomaly, and we'll be looking at it and provide feedback. On regulation number 11, regulation number 11 is talking about quality assurance. The proposal is basically a good one, whereby you are proposing considering the following text, including through the development of a quality assurance manual, which means that this is the need for the service provider to implement a quality assurance system. So this proposal is acceptable. However, I took note that this particular element can be included, for example, in the manual of NSO operations manual, if the service provider has such a document, and if they don't have, then indeed they need to develop this document as proposed as the quality assurance manual for flight procedure design. If I may be able to proceed under regulation number 12, the utilization of terrain data sets and terrain data for consistency, we shall be able to retain the term the terrain data. I think that particular error is regretted. However, we shall be able to make an amendment. On regulation 13 and 14, you have pointed out on the use of the term certificated or certified. I think is the key word here is certified to avoid confusion, and that's acceptable to us. Regulation number 16.6, there was an error in this particular area, which was basically instead of having after 5 sub regulation A, B, C, D, E, we should have had an F, but I think it went to 6. That particular anomaly should be able to be rectified. Under regulation number 19, you have also raised an issue in terms of errors published. One key thing that you have introduced is that the error detection and correction is communicated to all the affected users. That is also a very positive comment. I will say this is acceptable to us, and we will be able to include that in the subsequent edition. Comments have also been received on regulation number 20. Ensure that you use the correct title for the regulation referred. This shall be able to be reviewed, and the same to regulation number 21. However, on the fees charged, the Kenya Civil Aviation Authority publishes an not confirmation circular, and as indicated earlier by the moderator, we have these charges in place since the year 2012. They have not been reviewed since then, and there's an not confirmation circular that is published for this matter. And to that area, we will be able to relook at the section for consistency. And regulation 22 and 23, you have requested that we provide a timeline in terms of implementing the same in terms of the requests that have been able to be received. Regulation 22 and 23 are dealing on the review and the publication, for example, of the exemption applications in terms of non-compliant to this particular requirement, evaluation of the request, and within which timeline that the authority ought to review that. Regulation 28, your comment is that the court in terms of arbitration should be the last resort, and I think this is okay. However, we'll make reference to our legal department for input in terms of an amendment of this section for consistency with other regulation. I also appreciate that there is page 3 of your document, which has additional comments, basically which are editorial errors, which will be able to be brought on board. It's with thanks that I say this memorandum is rich in value and content, and we appreciate the information that has been shared to us. And Susan, I say thank you so much, plus Lois from Jerivia Advocates. Your input is so invaluable to us and very key, and is bound to add value, and will make this information this information or this regulation to be better, so that the same can be applied as appropriate. So with those remarks, I want to say thank you so much, and I want to return this session to the moderator for comments, having responded to all the issues that have been raised, and having gone through the matrix. I believe this is adequately covered, and unless there is a question, maybe we'll hold on and for further guidelines. Thank you so much, and take it over, Mr. Kimani, the moderator. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bwana Ondieki, for taking us through the draft civil aviation construction of visual and instrument flight procedures regulations 2021. We are grateful for all the participants that have been following us, both on this platform as well as on the Facebook Live. We have been live throughout we have been live on Facebook during the whole day, and the presentations and the comments that have been received therein have been responded to accordingly during this presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we wind up, I'm still calling for any additional comments or input that we can that you may have over the draft civil aviation regulations 2021 that have been developed. I can see we have a comment there from Mr. Gedhae Mwaniki. This is a request. Also, kindly, KCA, kindly repeat the presentation on the draft ATO regulations 2021, and kindly ensure a representative of AATO, that's the Association of Approved Training Organizations, make a presentation on their comments on the regulations as earlier submitted. Mr. Mwaniki, we take note of your request that has been received. We confirm that we received a very detailed written submission from the group AATO itself. We also received their request for some additional time to enable them make their presentation. This is under consideration by the management of KCA, and upon arriving at a decision, AATO will be given an opportunity to make their presentations that they had submitted. We confirm that they had presented a very detailed memorandum containing the comments on the approved training organization regulations 20, the draft civil aviation approved training organizations regulations 2021. So once a decision is arrived at, you will be updated accordingly in terms of submission of any additional comments. Similarly, in case you have any additional input or in case you have any additional comments on any of the regulations that have been mentioned, that have been discussed to date, you are kindly requested to forward the same through the dedicated email address, that is kcars2021@kcaa.or.ke. As has been mentioned throughout the presentations and throughout this forum, we will be compiling all the responses, the comments, the input, the questions that we have received so far, as well as the feedback that has been provided. We will collate all of them and tabulate them and put them in a tabular format. The same will be posted on the KCA website and available for scrutiny by the public. Thereafter, we'll have an opportunity of presenting the final version of the regulations, showing the changes or incorporating, showing the changes that have been incorporated. In case some of the proposals or comments or some of the proposals or comments have not been taken on board, you will see the reason indicated there as to why the proposal was not taken on board. Once again, I want to thank all of you who've been participating from morning up to this time. We have so far gone through 23 sets of regulations. We have 7 more to go, and out of the 23, one will be presented again. That is the draft civil aviation personnel licensing regulations 2021. The regulations will be presented again at from 11:30 by our senior licensing officer, Mr. James Mushemi. Now, the regulations that will be reviewed tomorrow, 7 in number, as I had mentioned. Most of them are under the communication, navigation, surveillance area. We have the radio navigation aids, the communication procedures, the air traffic services regulations, the communication systems, surveillance and collision avoidance systems, the aeronautical search and rescue regulations, and the draft civil aviation radio frequency spectrum utilization regulations. Our sessions will be starting from 8 o'clock tomorrow. Kindly make sure that you have joined us. Earlier on, I had shared the link to follow. I will be resharing it again to enable you join the session tomorrow. We will be starting at 8 o'clock in the morning. So as we come to the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, I'm thankful. KCA is thankful once again for the input that we have received so far, for the comments, for the questions that have been raised, and the areas of clarification that have been given so far. I also want to thank the panelists who've been with us today, as well as in earlier presentations. Thank you very much for the for responding, for taking us through the matrix of changes and responding to the questions and the comments that have been given. The sessions, as I have said, will be starting tomorrow at 8, and we will be having the personnel licensing regulation that had been presented on Monday morning. That's Monday at 8 o'clock. At 8:15 o'clock, we will have the same presented again from 11:30 tomorrow. Kindly make arrangements to attend, as well as let us have your written submissions on the regulations as early as possible, so that we can have prepare adequately in terms of responding to the comments, questions that have been asked throughout. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll kindly request to bring this session to an end and wish you a good evening. See you tomorrow. Asanteni.